at the end of term. The wee ones are still in with us today, and they're most welcome to be at the back and just be involved at the back of the church. I believe at Sunday school and youth will be back on again from next week as well. Okay, the creche room and the other room is available as a foyer if they do get a wee bit restless, but we're more than happy for everyone to be in with us today. You will appreciate it's been just because of Easter and different speakers, our preaching schedule's just been a wee bit more fluid. But what I've been doing over the last couple of months is been preaching on the book of Nehemiah. And the reason for that is that Nehemiah had been called of God to come and to restore and to rebuild the city, especially the city walls. And we are also in the middle of a major building project. And there's many lessons for us to learn from Nehemiah that we can apply to our present day situation. Now, most of the story so far has been about the call of God by Nehemiah, for Nehemiah, and then his mission and ministry, and back to Jerusalem, and envisioning the people. And then, of course, over the last few times we spoke about opposition, really from the people, non-Jewish people in and around the city who were feeling threatened that the city was being rebuilt again. And so we've been dealing a lot with opposition. And we are going to come back to that over the next few weeks, because that opposition in no way was abated until the walls were complete. But in chapter 5, we take a fresh turn of events, and John is going to come and read to us Nehemiah chapter 5. Thank you, John.
Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry against their fellow Jews. Some were saying, "We and our sons and daughters are numerous. In order for us to eat and stay alive, we must get grain." Others were saying, "We are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our homes to get grain during the famine." Still others were saying, "We have had to borrow money to pay the king's tax on our fields and vineyards. Although we are of the same flesh and blood as our fellow Jews, and though our children are as good as theirs, yet we have to subject our sons and daughters to slavery. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, but we are powerless because our fields and our vineyards belong to others." When I heard their outcry and their charges, I was very angry. I pondered them in my mind and then accused the nobles and officials. I told them, "You are charging your own people interest." So I called together a large meeting to deal with them and said, "As far as possible, we have bought back our fellow Jews who were sold to the Gentiles. Now you are selling your own people, only for them to be sold back to us." They kept quiet because they could find nothing to say. So I continued, "What you are doing is not right. Shouldn't you walk in the fear of our God to avoid the reproach of our Gentile enemies? I and my brothers and my men are also lending the people money and grain. But let us stop charging interest. Give back to them immediately their fields, vineyards, olive groves and houses, and also the interest you are charging them. 1% of the money, grain, new wine and olive oil." "We will give it back," they said, "and we will not demand anything more from them. We will do as you say." Then I summoned the priests and made the nobles and officials take an oath to do what they had promised. I also shook out the folds of my robe and said, "In this way may God shake out of their house and possessions anyone who does not keep the promise. So may such a person be shaken out and emptied." At this the whole assembly said, "Amen," and praised the Lord. and the people did as they had promised. Moreover, from the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when I was appointed to be their governor in the land of Judah, until his 32nd year, 12 years, neither I nor my brothers ate the food allotted to the governor. But the earlier governors, those preceding me, placed a heavy burden on the people and took 40 shekels of silver from them in addition to food and wine. Their assistants also lorded it over the people. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. Instead, I devoted myself to the work on the wall. All my men were assembled there for the work. We did not acquire any land. Furthermore, 150 Jews and officials ate at my table, as well as those who came to us from the surrounding nations. Each day 1 ox, 6 chosen sheep, and some poultry were prepared for them, and every 10 days an abundant supply of wine of all kinds. In spite of all this, I never demanded the food allocated to the governor, because the demands were heavy on these people. Remember me with favor, my God, for all I have done for these people.
Up until now, Nehemiah's difficulties have been from without. But now the problems come from within the Jewish community. Problems were starting to arise because of the financial burden of obviously getting the wall done, but because people were expected to make such big sacrifices. And some people, it was felt, was having to sacrifice even more. Now the men and their wives raised a great outcry. It's not often you see that the wives coming out in protest as well in biblical times, but we're saying, we can't do this anymore. We're mortgaging our houses. For many people, when they were deprived financially, then they would take out loans, but the security of those loans was their family and their children. And if they didn't pay the loans, then the children could be brought into slavery. And that was the very thing that was happening. And so in order to fulfill Nehemiah's vision, the burden was just becoming too much for many of the people around. Basic lack of food. There seemed to be a famine, or the back end of a famine, which only made the situation much worse because they were not able to get the food in order to sell it. The men were helping ferociously to rebuild the wall. Things were becoming economically unsustainable. We are mortgaging our fields and our vineyards and our homes to get grain during the famine, they complained. And so Nehemiah was faced with a problem that affected his workforce, a problem that affected the very community that he had come to defend and to protect. And they were the very ones who now were being exposed because of the great burden, not just because of the restoration of the wall, but because all of the effort was being put into that. And that was impacting progress. The parents of these enslaved children had become desperate. We are powerless because our fields and our vineyards are being bought by others. They had no means of buying back their young folks. No means of doing that. Some of our daughters have already been enslaved, and we are powerless to do anything about it. You'll see in this chapter, as John read, that there was a whole number of economic and political things that were taking place. And it was almost like the waves of circumstances. It's almost when you're dealing with a problem, when you're spinning one plate you can manage, but when you're spinning 3 or 4 plates it becomes incredibly difficult. And there were several concerns that were working against the people at this very point in time. The inability of the poor Jews to work the land and provide for themselves. The way the work in the wall would suffer if the people were not able to fulfill their commitments. If a mounting financial burden on mortgages and taxation, we read that the king's tax had become almost impossible to pay because there was literally no food left on the table. Today's poverty is, and we have to apply it to the world in which we live and the country in which we abide, and even within the walls of our own city, that there are many people living in poverty. We cannot speak about this particular verse without dealing with the complex issue of inequality, of social inequality, and we will come back to Nehemiah's story and how he managed that. Today's poverty leads to heartache, depression, social discontent, and shame. It has an impact on people's mental health. It can lead to criminality and drug and alcohol abuse simply as a form of escapism. People feel trapped in a world that they can never get out of. For those of you who are not aware of the tragic statistics before us, that 20% of the UK's population, that's almost 13 million people, are living in relative poverty after housing costs. That's 1 in 5 people are living below the poverty line. Of these, 8 million people are in the working age bracket but are unable to find work. 4 million of them are children. 1.9 million of them are pensioners. Around 2 in every 10 adults are in poverty in the UK. And that when I read those statistics over the weekend, because we live, as God brings us out into almost at times a place of comfort and relative safety, it's easy for us to become disconnected from the heartache of the world in which we live. We become disassociated with some of the real issues that are taking place. York, by its very nature, is a relatively wealthy city, but don't let that disguise you. There are homeless people, and there's hundreds, not thousands, of people who live in York who live below the poverty line. Families, and who are most affected in this tragedy? Families with 3 or 4 more children can be massively impacted because of the extra burden of finances. And obviously, having more children might limit those families by how much childcare or work that they can do because of those circumstances. Minority ethnic groups, over half the people from Bangladesh and half the people from Pakistan, 49%, live in poverty. I find that staggering. That half of the Pakistani population in the UK are living in poverty. Around 4 in 10 people, households headed by black people, live in poverty. 40%. Disabled people, the poverty rate for disabled people rises from 20% to 30% because of the incapacity at times to be able to work and the extra financial burden it is to manage their disability. Informal carers, people who are caring, having to give up work to care for others and not being supported to do that. Something that comes closer to our particular church is asylum seekers. Asylum, we are inundated really with false information about asylum seekers. We're told that asylum seekers are living in luxury hotels with 60-inch TVs, and that's just not the reality. Not the reality at all. Many of them are put into hostels, limited accommodation. And allow me just to give you the financial figures for asylum seekers. Asylum seekers, if they're in a hotel where they provide basic food, after that, in order to buy their clothes, in order to have food and for mobile. If they give food, if the hotel gives food, they are given a certain amount of money to spend on any small luxuries like clothes or books or mobile phones. And the amount that those asylum seekers get is £10 a week. £10 a week. Okay? They get £49 a week if the hotel doesn't provide food, and that goes up to £49. And that includes toiletries, food, and clothing. Asylum seekers are generally not allowed to work because of their immigration status. So they're caught in a situation that is just impossible. When we were in Gloucester, we had a charity shop, and we were not even allowed, the asylum seekers who we had in the church were not allowed to work as volunteers while their application was at the Home Office. Very often what would happen with asylum seekers for the UK government, which I couldn't get my head around, that if there was any indication that asylum seekers were building a community around them, and there are 7 or so cities of refuge that when they come into the country, they're sent to Liverpool or Glasgow, and Gloucester being one of them. And they're put into a hostel, and if the hostel gives them food, they get £10 a week to survive on. But if there's any indication that they're working even as volunteers, they will get sent a letter and they will be moved the next day to another city. If they're making a friendship community, they can be easily displaced into another city. We would often receive letters from pastors in Bristol and in Liverpool saying, we've got an asylum seeker coming from our church, could you meet them at the bus stop? Because they've been asked to move. Such is the heartache that goes on with such limited circumstances. And when I heard the outcry and these charges, I became very angry. And I pondered them in my heart. He's affronted. He cannot. I mean, he had been lending money himself. He owns up to that, but he didn't realise that there was other unscrupulous people who were charging interest. He's affronted and he's frustrated and he's angry. And he's first, and he responds by calling a meeting and calling those people the aggressors of these victims, and calling them out and saying that this cannot continue. If the vision that we have before us is going to be fulfilled, in fact, it forgets about we'll come back to the wall, but it says this is an affront to God. This cannot be right. This does not honour God. This is not why we were brought out of Egypt, in order to be brought back into slavery again. And we need to get this situation sorted. He was shocked that anyone would capitalise on the hard economic circumstances for personal profit. If you look at the interest rates of payday loans, don't be surprised that the APR of some of those interest rates are 650%. So the very poorest of people who need to borrow money instantly are being charged thousands of times the amount to pay that back. And so he becomes, he had already dealt in our last sermon in chapter 4 with external threats from Sanballat and Tobiah. That was to be expected. But it's much worse when the threat to a community is internal, and we were not even taking care of his own. And so he calls a meeting. I and my brothers and my men are also lending money in grain, but we have to stop charging interest. We have to put an end to this tragedy. And believers, we as believers, throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament into modern Christendom, are reminded that we live on a greater stage than just the small world in which we live. We live in a stage that goes beyond our self-interest and becomes social responsibility and corporate responsibility, and sharing in some of that pain and heartache. Fundamentally, believers must live in the proper fear of God. And what we find from the writings of Moses all the way through to the writings of Paul, that we are responsible to look after the poor. That we need to make sure that we speak up for the poor. that we defend those who have been ostracized. We have got a responsibility in order to not just sit back and let the politicians deal with that. He asked the question in our reading, should you not walk in the fear of God? Paul writing to, we had a very similar situation in Acts chapter 6, where people were being left out of the food supply. And then later on in Acts chapter 15, in the first council of the church, the people of God were reminded that they were to avoid sexual sins and to look after the poor. And so this message carries into our very present day. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians, since then we know what it is to fear the Lord. We try to persuade others. And what is plain to God, and I hope that this is also plain to your conscience as well. And so there's a sense that we need to learn to hear from God outside the walls of our own comfortable church. When we think about the vision of Monkgate, then it's not just so that we can have a nice building. It's not so that we can have fancy lights and a nice welcome team. But the reason that God has placed us in that part of the city has to transcend beyond just a building. And it has to become a blessing to the community around us. We will give it back, they said, and we will not demand anything more. But Zacchaeus stood up and he said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay it back 4 times. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to your household. And I'm very nervous to make any correlation between works and faith and salvation. But Jesus is saying that the evidence of our commitment to God and the evidence of our salvation is demonstrated by the works that we do in the time that we have left here in this world. We know that very, fearful passage of Scripture when God separates the sheep and the goats. And it was based upon what they did, not just what they believed. I fundamentally and will never undermine that we are saved by faith and by grace alone. But when that salvation comes knocking on our door, it requires us to take action and for our lives and our worldview to be shaped by the heart of God. And God has a heart for people who have less, who have nothing, who are deprived, and who have been pushed to the very edges of society. And Nehemiah then sets an example. Moreover, neither my brothers nor I ate the food that was allotted to us as governors. And we realised the massive differential between the rich and the poor, the haves and the haves not. But Nehemiah realised that in order for him to associate with those who were suffering, then he needed to identify with those who were suffering. Moreover, from the 20th year of the King Artaxerxes, I was appointed to be governor in the land of Judah until the 32nd year. Neither my brothers nor I ate the food that was allotted to us. In fact, Nehemiah, out of his own pocket, had a banquet and he invited 150 people to come and eat with him every day. That would indicate, it says, they killed an ox every day to feed those people who came to his table. And it didn't come out of the coffers of taxation, but it came out of his own pocket. And all I ask us as a people of God to make sure that in our luxuries, that we remember those who have less than us. It's always difficult for me, and I place myself, I'm walking through town, and I see somebody begging for money. There's a number of things happening now. Very often I don't have cash on me. we live in a cashless society, and that makes it more difficult. And it just takes a little bit of forethought to have a few pounds in our pocket in order to prepare for that eventuality. But secondly, we're torn because of alcohol and drug abuse and criminality. Most of us now are nervous to give cash in case that cash is misused. But as we deal with that issue, that moral, that ethical issue that's standing before us, that doesn't mean that the person sitting before us is not in dire straits. That their lives is not a mess. They wouldn't be sitting there if that wasn't the case. And I realise, and you know, if you go to somewhere like Glasgow, then the streets are inundated with people who are begging, and it's impossible for us to manage every single one of those individuals. But it doesn't excuse us to not care. It doesn't excuse us to not care. And we have a responsibility in order to think about doing what we can in order to help people's lives just become a little bit better. But out of reverence for God, I did not act like that. I just think it's just such a stark statement. This is not just about financial equality. This is about the testimony of God's precious name. When you pray, pray these words, hallowed be your name. And this is about honouring the name of God. It's not even who we're giving money to. It's who we're giving money for. And when we look after the poor, we are representing Jesus Christ. When we move into Monkgate, and there's been a lot of incredibly positive discussion. The guys on their WhatsApp group have discussed many opportunities that we can use with the building. We've got some wonderful people around us who serve in frontline charity ministries, who look after those who are disadvantaged. We are so blessed as a church to be able to do that. It's staggering. But it's still easy for us to compartmentalise the problem to the food bank or the charity shops, and they will do that. But can I just say that as we prepare to move into Monkgate, it's all of our problem. Every one of us has a responsibility to think about how we are going to serve our community and to find out what the needs of our community are and to reach out to them. I don't do this just as in order to elevate the church. But the school, Parkgrove School, wrote to us recently, and they said there was 10 or so families who were not able to go on residential, and could we help? And I am honoured to say that our elders decided to pay for all those children. And the impact that had on the school was overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. And the response that we've had between the school and ourselves, because of that small act of kindness that we as a church demonstrated. And we need to understand our community. We need to pray into our community. And we need to look after our community. And that might mean picking up litter, decorating people's homes, and there's some amazing organisations who do that. But for us to be involved in those organisations like York Neighbours, like the Food Bank, we can serve our community. So when we are preparing to move into Monkgate, don't just think about how we can serve York Elim Church. Ask ourselves how we can serve our community and what we can do corporately and individually to make people's lives a little bit better. And as I close this morning and come to a close, I just want us to be able to understand that this is about the gospel. This is about the kindness of God. This is about the heart of God. Remember me with favour, my God, for all that I have done for these people. He's not bragging. He's not boasting. He's really asking for God's continued blessing. Jesus says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and everything else will be added to you. And over the next few months, James and the finance team are going to have to look very carefully at the budget of the investment that we have in our building. But we must never, ever stop being generous. And we must never hoard that money. Everything that we have is on loan, and everything that we have has a future investment and a future purpose. So what are the principles that we can close with today? God is just and is deeply concerned about justice. Strength of character and personal integrity matter more to God than just talents or skills. God cares for the poor. Christians should care for people above profit. And we are to have integrity in all that we do. That's what we'll discover when we unpack Nehemiah chapter 5. And I'm standing before you to say that this is not just about Monkgate, but this is about God's heart for our city and for those who are disadvantaged. And we need to have conversations with lots of people how we can play our part in community and in society, and for those people who are hurting, and for those people who feel that they cannot get out of the massive black hole that they find themselves in. Bless you. Adam, I did offer you the opportunity. You don't have to say anything, but I wanted you, if you wanted to close or not, what we can do to help with food bank, anything. The floor is yours. For those of you who don't know, Adam oversees a food bank across our city and the surrounding areas, and I think he's got 4 or 5